Hello, my name is Margaret Adele, and I once read 6 books in a day. Fairly recently, too. Not too long ago, I did a 24-hour readathon with other members of the group chat I am a part of, and I beat my record for books read in a day, and I read 6. My previous record being the last time I did a 24-hour readathon, and I read 4, but I had an overall much more miserable time at that time. So if you don't know, a 24-hour readathon is basically what it says on the tin. For 24 hours, you try to read as much as possible. And seeing as I had 2 very wildly different takes on a 24-hour readathon, I've kind of put together a list of tips, tricks, do's, don'ts, and general rules to get the most out of your 24-hour readathon. Now, I do not mean to say that if you do all of these, you will read 6 books in a day. I am aware that my reading speed is already fairly fast. I can generally read about a page a minute in standard books, about 1 page every minute and a half or 2 minutes for older classics, and then like 2 pages a minute for things like mid-grade and wide-spaced novels. But using some of these tricks, you might be able to increase the amount you read by just a little bit. So first up is when to do a 24-hour readathon. This is a lot more crucial than you think it is. It's not just a day off work. It usually needs to be a period of time in which you generally feel like you have more space and less stress. So if you have a day off in the middle of a holiday break, but literally every other day of the holiday break is you running around and having to get things and finish up things, that 1 day off probably is going to make for a great 24-hour readathon. Or if in general you've just been really stressed out because of X, Y, and Z, and it's 2020, we're all stressed out because of X, Y, Z, it's okay to just be like, you know what, my head's not in it, and head's not in a 24-hour readathon right now. That's completely valid. But if you do have a lot of space, a full day off would be ideal, but I have seen people do this with like a day of work, and just a general period in your life in which you're not super stressed would be the perfect time for a 24-hour readathon. Now, obviously, it's better, I believe, with friends. I've done it by myself, and it's a little bit more lonely than being able to be like, who's doing the 24-hour this weekend? But I understand that because these kind of readathons aren't very prevalent in the community, at least not with any regularity like other readathons, you might end up doing it alone regardless. But if you can find friends to do it with you, highly suggest it. So one of the first things you want to do when you get into your 24-hour readathon is prep. And you want to create not necessarily like a hard and fast TBR of all the books you must read, but more like a short list of books that you're definitely not all going to read in the same day, but this way you don't have to make a decision from such a wide variety, but you also get a little bit of wiggle room. Now, I am a mood reader hardcore, and I don't often read the same kind of books twice in a row unless it's within the same series and I'm spree reading that series specifically. So I knew in my 24-hour readathon, I needed to come up with a variety of genres to work with. Now, I would actually suggest staying away from any genre that involves a large amount of world building, high fantasy, hard sci-fi, and the like, because those tend to create a slower pace of reading at the beginning when you're first taking in all of that world building. And then if you're trying to read multiple books in a day with world building, you might get your worlds mixed up. So that doesn't mean you only have to read like contemporaries, but generally read books where the base world is somewhat similar to the world you're already living in, with maybe like another level on top of it. This would be your horrors, your urban fantasies, your romances, or otherwise read a book that is something that's so similar to you in world scope that it doesn't really matter that it's not your world, or a genre that has such a steady, rarely ever like distance from world building, i.e. a Regency romance, that you basically know the world, like you know your own. And those are going to be the best ones to pick. And I suggest, if you're a mood reader like me, switching between them. So if you started off with a light contemporary, do a horror next, and then do like a satire next, to kind of not only give yourself a palate cleanse, but also make it a little bit easier to remember the books you read. Because if you read a lot in a day, and then it all becomes one giant gray blur, well, then what was the point? But if you can kind of segment it out, it makes for a lot easier remembering. Me personally, when I did my 6 books in a day, they were actually all fairly short books. I did like a poetry book, an erotica short story collection. I think the biggest book I read that day was just over 300 pages, and that was in like a comedy on fandom culture, which I really liked actually. So you kind of want to be very careful with the kinds of books you're picking, but then give yourself a big enough list to pick from. Not so big that you're frozen by indecision, but big enough that if that 1 or 2 books that you had planned to read aren't really working for you in that moment, you can go with a different one instead. Now, one of the tips that I've seen some people suggest for a 24-hour readathon, but I would actually caution against, is staying up through the night. I did that in my first 24-hour readathon, and I was really proud of myself for doing it. I think I zonked out around like 6 a.m. and woke up and forced myself to get up at like 9 a.m. So I didn't go like wholly without sleep, but basically was not any kind of healthy amount of sleep, and it honestly whacked out my whole day, because while I didn't necessarily feel physically tired all that much, my brain was so zoned out from all of the media consumption that I had done overnight to then continue to do more media consumption during the day. So by the time that I got to the 3rd book, my brain was like, we lost out on that 8 hours of nice dark time, and now we're still going at it. And so I actually, during the middle of the day, kind of slowed down and took gigantic breaks because my brain was done. So in this last one, I stayed up until 1 a.m. to get a really short memoir and one of the short stories finished, and then went to bed and woke up the next morning and continued. And that went a lot better. I still got my nice brain dark time, but also had a little bit of the fun of staying up late to read books, which isn't as much fun when you're an adult and you can stay up late whenever you want anyway. But there's still an element of I am up late that goes along with it. Now, I do not mean to say that you shouldn't take any breaks. Obviously, there are certain times when your eyes are just going to be strained, or you need to eat food, or you need to drive somewhere, or you have a little in the house that is demanding your attention. And it is perfectly fine to step away, even encouraged. The trick is that you need to remember that you need to go back to reading eventually. So say something like, only take breaks if you have a specific thing to do in said break, and then when said specific thing is done or said specific time limit has ended, you can then go back to reading. So in this way, you still get the breaks, you still give yourself a brain break, as we call it in my profession, but you don't forget to go back later. Now, one of the most important things that I've also noticed, and that's the easiest to get stressed on, is the number of books you're reading and getting very preoccupied with, oh, I have to read a gigantic list of books. And this is a problem with BookTube in general, where you constantly feel like you have to be reading this giant list of books to the extent that you're picking books that you don't even like just because they're short and you can read them and add to the list. And that's a problem because I think, if I remember correctly, all of the books I read in the first 24-hour readathon I did were mostly picked because of their length, and I didn't rank anything above a 3-star at that moment. This time, I actually picked a couple books that were longer, and because they were books that I was specifically interested in, it actually read easier. A 300-page book with a premise you're really intrigued by will always read faster than a 200-page book that you're iffy about. What you're reading matters as much as the number of books you're reading. But if you're really wanting to get into that mindset of getting into the numbers and feeling discouraged by the number of books, might I suggest instead counting the number of pages. Now, on my last 24-hour readathon, I actually read over 1,000 pages. I believe 1,140 something. I can't remember exactly. But going based on that number, even though 6 was already kind of a big number for books read in a day, that was also a fun number to have on the side. So maybe you're not reading a ton of books in a day, but you're reading really big books, and you can still give out these big numbers of pages instead of numbers of books. Because let's be honest, if you get caught up in that numbers of books mentality, you're going to skip out on some fantastic big books because you just don't have the time. And the last one is some things to stay away from when you're trying to do a 24-hour readathon. And one of those is the major end of a beloved series. As we all know, if you read that big bombastic ending in that series you've loved for years, regardless of how it ends, you're probably going to end up with a book hangover. It might not even be a very long hangover, but a 12-hour book hangover on a 24-hour readathon still gonna mess you up. So stay away from maybe those super ultra hyped will cause a hangover books and stick more to things that you still know you like. A 24-hour readathon is not necessarily the time to be like, I am going to jump in out of my comfort zone and read all of these books that I've never read before. Because kind of the fun of a 24-hour readathon is reading things that you know you like, so you get a lot of good bookness in a short period of time. If you're jumping into horror but you're easily scared, or high fantasy and that's not really your jam, you're gonna trip yourself up. So you gotta stick to what you know you like, but something that is not so monumental that your love for it will overshadow everything else and kill your reading in the middle of the day. So that was my mini discussion. I think it's very easy to forget that we're in a different situation when you're a booktuber, because when you are a booktuber and looking at other bookish people online, it's so easy to make the numbers you read feel small. And when I talk to other booktubers about having read X amount of books in a day, they're still like impressed. But then I mention it to like non-booktube friends, they're like, you read 6 books in a day. So regardless of how many books you do or do not read during a 24-hour readathon, regardless of if the day got away from you and gets so stressful that you read barely anything, keep in mind that a 24-hour readathon, all readathons, pretty much all reading, at least fiction, is meant to be for fun and enjoyable. You're meant to get something else out of it other than a feeling of productivity. And I would sincerely hope that if you ever do try one of these, you don't let it stress you out too badly. It is never a fail in a readathon. Readathons are all optional. They're all just for fun. So if you had fun, or at least didn't hate it too much, it's basically a win. If you've ever done a 24-hour readathon or have your own kind of records for books read in X amount of time, please let me know. I'd be interested to see that. I don't really know where I rank in BookTube along the how many books read in X amount of time. I'm never going to be one of those booktubers that can read 20 in a month. That's just not in my wheelhouse. But regardless, thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day and a marvelous tomorrow.